Gangs of New York wasn't just historical drama, it was America carved open with a knife. A city built on blood, fire, and men clawing for streets that belonged to no one. But beneath the top hats, the butcher aprons, and the smoke curling over 5 Points, the film was already a war before the cameras ever rolled. Day-Lewis trained so hard he crossed straight into danger. Scenes disappeared into lost cuts no audience will ever recover, and a blink-fast cameo hid in plain sight for decades. These are 15 weird facts about Gangs of New York, where every gang fell, every empire burned, and the city refused to die. Number 1. Martin Scorsese wasn't looking for a new project on New Year's Day in 1970. He simply picked up Herbert Asbury's Gangs of New York, and it hit him like a revelation. The book read like a secret chapter of American history, gang wars, political corruption, and the raw beginnings of the city he grew up in. By the time he closed the cover, he could already see the movie in his head. He bought the rights in 1979 and asked Jay Cox to write an early script. But throughout the 80s and 90s, every major studio passed. The shadow of Heaven's Gate loomed over Hollywood, and anything involving huge sets, thousands of extras, or historical reconstruction was treated like financial poison. Still, Scorsese kept pushing. Film after film, year after year, the idea stayed with him. And when Miramax finally agreed to finance it in 1999, he returned to the story he'd been carrying since the moment he opened that book. A film born on New Year's Day finally found its way to the screen after more than 3 decades. Number 2. For many viewers, the gangs in Gangs of New York feel larger than life. The surprising part is that Scorsese actually toned them down. The Dead Rabbits, Bowery Boys, and 40 Thieves were real 5 Points factions, and their violence was far beyond what the film could show. Police reports from the 1830s to 1850s describe street battles involving hundreds of fighters, political intimidation tied to Tammany Hall, and weapons ranging from butcher cleavers to slingshots and brickbats. These weren't movie props. They were pulled straight from historical descriptions and early newspaper illustrations. Costume designer Sandy Powell and production designer Dante Ferretti studied mugshots, lithographs, and archived sketches to rebuild the look of the era. Even Hellcat Maggie came straight from the record, a woman known for metal claws and filed teeth, feared across 5 Points long before her legend reached Hollywood. The movie's brutality feels intense, but it's still only a glimpse. The real 5 Points was a place where crime, politics, and survival were bound together, and where gangs shaped the early democracy of New York City. Number 3. Scorsese wanted Gangs of New York to feel rooted in real violence and real politics, so the film opens with an Irish nativist street battle drawn straight from documented riots in the 1830s. Newspapers at the time described clubs, cleavers, and cobblestones flying as police struggled to break up mobs spilling through Pearl Street. Production designers studied those period sketches and eyewitness reports, building a world that already looked like chaos before the cameras even started rolling. He kept that same approach for the 1863 draft riots, the uprising that tore through New York for 4 days and became one of the darkest chapters in the city's history. Buildings burned, federal troops marched through the streets, and black New Yorkers were targeted in racial violence. Scorsese treated the event as the film's emotional and political spine because it captured exactly what he wanted the story to say. This city was born in conflict, but there was a problem history couldn't solve. The real Bill Poole, the man who inspired Bill the Butcher, died in 1855, 8 years before the draft riots. Scorsese wasn't ready to lose his central adversary halfway through the story, so he rebuilt him. He shifted Poole into Bill Cutting, extended the character's lifespan, and shaped him into a symbol of nativist power stretching across decades. It wasn't meant to fool historians. It was meant to keep the film's themes intact. In the end, the movie plays like a hybrid: real events, real factions, and a villain who stands in for an entire era instead of a single man. Scorsese didn't rewrite history to soften it. He rewrote it to reveal its shape. Number 4. Long before Daniel Day-Lewis stepped into the role, Scorsese tried to build Gangs of New York around a very different Bill the Butcher. In the late 70s, he imagined an early version of the film with John Belushi as the Butcher and Dan Aykroyd as Amsterdam. It would have been a wilder, rougher movie, but that version collapsed the moment Belushi died. As the project drifted through the 80s and 90s, the role kept changing hands. Robert De Niro circled it for a time, but when he learned the production required half a year in Europe, he stepped away. Tom Hanks came closest next. He loved the script, but he was already locked into Road to Perdition and couldn't make the dates work. By the time Scorsese reached the end of the 90s, Bill the Butcher had become the part no one could hold on to, until Day-Lewis read the script. He signed on in 1999 and built a version of the character so fierce and deliberate that it made all the earlier casting paths feel like alternate timelines. After 2 decades of false starts, Scorsese finally had his Butcher. Number 5. When Amsterdam steps back into 5 Points after healing from his wounds, the moment feels unnervingly familiar, and that's intentional. Scorsese staged the shot as a living recreation of Jacob Riis's 1888 photograph Bandit's Roost, one of the most famous images ever taken of New York's underworld. Riis captured a narrow alley on Mulberry Street crowded with gang members staring directly into the lens, framed by leaning buildings and shadows thick as smoke. Production studied every part of that image: the posture of the men, the angle of the alley, even the way Riis positioned his subjects in tiers of intimidation. Scorsese rebuilt it brick by brick. The actors take the same poses, the same eye lines, the same wary expressions that Riis recorded more than a century earlier. For anyone who knows the photograph, the moment hits immediately. The film folds real history into its own myth, and Amsterdam's return becomes more than character work. It becomes a resurrection drawn straight from New York's past. Number 6. Daniel Day-Lewis didn't warm up to Bill the Butcher. He built him from the ground up. When Scorsese cast him, the work started quietly at Day-Lewis's home in Ireland, where he brought in 2 circus knife specialists to teach him how to move like a man who lived with blades. They drilled balance, stance, weight shifts, and the subtle body language that tells someone they're in danger before a knife is ever drawn. By the time he left Wicklow, the knives no longer felt like props. They were part of his posture. He pushed further by apprenticing in a butcher shop, learning to break down carcasses, sharpen blades properly, and hold his body the way 19th century butchers did in old daguerreotypes. Crew members said that even when he wasn't performing, he carried himself like a man who expected a fight at any moment. Then came the prosthetic eye, the detail that turned his preparation into something unforgettable. Makeup artists at Cinecittà fit him with a rigid acrylic shell engraved with an American eagle. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It didn't feel pain. During early tests, Day-Lewis realized he could touch the surface without reacting, so he picked up a straight razor and tapped the blade against the prosthetic. Makeup staff tried to stop him, but he kept practicing until he could hit the eye cleanly, with no flinch. Scorsese recognized immediately that the gesture told audiences everything about Bill's psyche without a single line of dialogue. Cinematographer Michael Ballhaus even adjusted shots to make room for it. What started as actor experimentation became one of the film's defining character moments. A razor pressed to an unblinking eye, delivered by an actor who had turned months of training into instinct. Number 7. Recreating the voice of 1860s New York wasn't as simple as choosing an Irish or American dialect. Almost no recordings of that era exist, so the production treated language like archaeology. Dialect coach Tim Monick dug through phonetic spellings, old stage manuals, and the rarest evidence of all, wax cylinder recordings from the 1890s. One of them, Walt Whitman reading America, offered tiny clues: flattened vowels, clipped R sounds, and a cadence shaped by Dutch, Irish, and early American speech patterns. Daniel Day-Lewis used those fragments as a foundation. Working for months with Monick, he built a voice that felt older than the city itself. He practiced as he butchered carcasses, as he handled knives, and even between takes, never slipping out of rhythm. By the time the cameras rolled, Bill the Butcher didn't just look like a man from another century, he sounded like one. Other cast members didn't have the same ease. Leonardo DiCaprio's hybrid Irish-American accent drifted under emotional pressure, and Cameron Diaz fought a losing battle with a dialect that critics said seemed to fade in and out from scene to scene. The contrast was striking. Day-Lewis's voice carried the weight of history, while others sounded anchored in modern Hollywood cadence. It wasn't intentional, but it made Bill feel even more imposing. The one man who seemed to belong to the old New York Scorsese was resurrecting. Number 8. When Scorsese set out to rebuild 1860s Manhattan, he didn't want a digital world. He wanted a place the actors could step into and feel. So, production designer Dante Ferretti constructed an entire city at Cinecittà Studios, a mile-long backlot with working storefronts, alleyways, butcher shops, docks, and even a full waterfront. It was the kind of city Hollywood once built in the 1950s, but hadn't attempted in decades. George Lucas visited the set while preparing Attack of the Clones and told Scorsese, almost as a warning, no one will ever build something this big again. And he was right. Scorsese planned to shoot the entire film practically. Real mud, real firelight, real walls, no digital tricks. But one scene called for a circus elephant walking through the chaos of New York's political underworld, and suddenly the production hit a wall. Italy had no certified elephant trainers, no safe filming conditions, and no animal that met legal requirements. Every workaround failed, and that's when Lucas stepped in, studying the lighting and the camera placement, and quietly suggesting how one digital creature could be blended into Ferretti's real city without breaking the film's texture. The result was the first and only CGI shot in the entire 3-hour epic. A single elephant placed into a world built entirely by hand. It became the dividing line between eras. Everything before it belonged to old Hollywood craftsmanship. Everything after belonged to the digital age. Number 9. The first assembly cut of Gangs of New York ran 3 hours and 38 minutes. A sprawling, brutal, living mural of 5 points that Scorsese Scorsese and editor Thelma Schoonmaker shaped again and again through a long series of recuts. By the end, they had crafted at least 18 different versions, each one another attempt to find the heartbeat of a story that stretched across decades of New York's violent history. Harvey Weinstein pushed hard for a shorter runtime, but Scorsese resisted the idea that any single cut was the original. He saw the process as evolution, each draft a refinement, not a compromise. By the time they reached the theatrical version, the film had been sculpted into 2 hours and 47 minutes of dense, muscular storytelling. Scorsese later confirmed the earlier long cuts are gone. They're not sitting in a vault, they're not waiting for a director's edition, and they were never preserved in releasable form. The version that reached theaters is the only version the world will ever see, the final shape of a film forged through nearly 20 distinct identities. Number 10. When Miramax agreed to make Gangs of New York, it was supposed to be the crown jewel of the studio's prestige era, a grand historical epic from Martin Scorsese, fueled by one of the largest budgets Miramax had ever touched. But as Ferretti's enormous sets rose at Cinecittà and delays piled up, the budget blew past 80 million, then 90, and eventually crossed the 100 million line. For a studio built on small, award-friendly films, the cost was catastrophic. Executives whispered that if Gangs failed, Miramax might fail with it. Weinstein scrambled to keep the production alive, selling off rights, borrowing against future profits, and quietly shifting money from other films. The box office, when it finally arrived, wasn't bad, nearly 200 million worldwide, but much of that revenue didn't belong to Miramax anymore. It had already been sold to keep the project afloat. Then came Oscar night, 10 nominations, months of campaigning, and in the end, nothing. Chicago, another Miramax movie, dominated the night instead. The cheaper film, the safer film, the one that brought in the money Gangs couldn't. For Scorsese, it was one of the most painful award seasons of his career. For Miramax, it was the moment the studio realized that prestige dreams could carry a devastating price. Hey, hard to imagine a single movie pushing a studio to the edge, isn't it? If this raw fight for art and survival pulls you in, you can bring Gangs of New York home. Just check the links below for the Blu-ray or DVD. Thanks for the support. It truly means a lot. Now, let's walk back into the streets that started it all. Number 11. Harvey Weinstein locked Gangs of New York into a Christmas 2002 release, not realizing, or not caring, that Leonardo DiCaprio's Catch Me If You Can was already scheduled for the exact same day. Overnight, DiCaprio became the center of a marketing disaster. If both films held their dates, he'd be forced to promote two competing holiday blockbusters, splitting interviews, splitting audiences, and inevitably hurting the box office of both movies. It turned into a behind-the-scenes negotiation between DiCaprio, Weinstein, and DreamWorks chief Jeffrey Katzenberg, none of whom wanted their film overshadowed by the other. The tension finally broke when Gangs shifted to December 20th, giving it a small head start and sparing DiCaprio from the surreal and potentially damaging spectacle of going to war with himself on opening weekend. Number 12. The closing time-lapse of Gangs of New York, the shot that lifts 5 points into modern Manhattan, was finished before 9/11. The Twin Towers stood tall in the final frame. After the attacks, studio executives quietly suggested removing the towers out of sensitivity, but Scorsese refused. To him, you don't censor the truth of a city's history, even when that truth carries pain. He believed the film's arc, from lawless alleys to a metropolis built over blood and conflict, would feel incomplete if the towers were erased, so he left them untouched. When Gangs premiered 15 months after 9/11, the image no longer served as a simple endpoint. It became a tribute, unplanned, raw, and deeply emotional, to the city Scorsese had spent his entire career trying to understand. Number 13. Gangs of New York wasn't just a period epic. It was the moment Leonardo DiCaprio and Martin Scorsese found each other. Until then, Scorsese had been synonymous with Robert De Niro. DiCaprio was the rising star of a new generation, but once they began working together, Scorsese saw something he hadn't expected. An actor who could carry both bruising toughness and quiet vulnerability. Someone who could inhabit characters torn between myth and morality. Their collaboration on Gangs became the foundation for a creative partnership that reshaped modern cinema. Together they followed it with The Aviator, The Departed, Shutter Island, and The Wolf of Wall Street. Films that defined DiCaprio's evolution and extended Scorsese's legacy into a new century. What began on the muddy streets of 5 Points became one of the most important director-actor alliances of the last 25 years. Number 14. Martin Scorsese slips into Gangs of New York so quietly that most viewers never notice him. He appears as the wealthy gentleman Jenny Everdeen targets during her turtle dove pickpocket scam. A brief, elegant distraction built on charm, eye contact, and misdirection. What the film never draws attention to is that Scorsese's infant daughter Francesca also appears in the scene. Because he refused to bring her anywhere near the mud-soaked chaos of the 5 Point sets, the cameo was staged in a refined, clean setting instead. Polished floors, soft lighting, none of the grime grime he'd spent years recreating. Scorsese later joked that he would have preferred to play a filthy street tough, but fatherhood won out. In the end, the cameo became something sweeter, the director placing himself and his baby daughter inside the history he'd devoted 3 decades to resurrecting. Number 15. Daniel Day-Lewis built Bill the Butcher from 19th century research, butcher apprenticeships, and months of knife work. But the soundtrack behind that fury came from the early 2000s. He told Rolling Stone he blasted Eminem's The Way I Am at 5 in the morning, letting the anger, rhythm, and raw defiance seep into Bill's swagger. Day-Lewis said he always searches for modern music that unlocks a character's psychology, even if the story is set centuries earlier. Eminem's relentless energy became the fuse he lit before walking onto set. You don't hear the rap in the movie, of course, but the rage is there in every glare, every stomp, every blade drawn. One of cinema's most terrifying villains was powered by one of hip-hop's most explosive voices. Gangs of New York was never just a period piece. It was Scorsese rebuilding a city that barely left clues behind, resurrecting real gang wars, real politics, and a version of Manhattan carved from mud, blood, and ambition. Every frame feels like obsession. Scorsese's obsession to make it, Day-Lewis's obsession to vanish inside it, and our obsession, decades later, to step back into that world every time the drums begin to pound. If you grew up with this film, you still feel that spark, that shiver when Bill the Butcher enters the room like he owns the century. And if you're discovering it now, it's a reminder that New York didn't rise from blueprints or dreams. It rose from conflict, from pride, from people fighting for a place to stand. So drop a comment and tell us which film you want us to uncover next, because some movies don't just recreate history, they make you feel like you survived it.